glad you guys like the idea of digression itself. We started with the Lord's Prayer. Just very, very briefly, I just want to point out one main takeaway from the Lord's Prayer, giving kind of an excuse to get back to the Lord's Prayer just for a second, because it provides a kind of segue into what we're doing. And that is, I think that the world has entirely missed the point of the pivotal phrase of the Lord's Prayer. It's in Matthew, and it's in our standard version of the Lord's Prayer that Christians say in church every Sunday morning. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And please don't put a comma into that. We sometimes think it's two thoughts, but it's one thought. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. No pause on earth as it is in heaven, but it's an insistence that something be realized that now only exists, and now a kind of daring idea. It exists now only in heaven. It doesn't exist on earth. The idea for a certain kind of revolutionary, and Marx, by the way, Karl Marx, it gets a little scary, was to repeat the same conception. The trouble with things right now is that human beings have realized their ideals only in a dreamland. God does live in that dreamland, and God is the wonderful dream. That's not to take away. It's a reality. But it's only a spiritual reality. This is the interesting part about this. The call is for the materialization of what is now only a spiritual idea, making it actual amongst ourselves. This is the daring idea. This is what makes him a revolutionary. This is what makes Jesus, in fact, a religious radical. He wants to bring heaven down to earth. There's also a Promethean dimension to this. You know the old story of Prometheus, who stole the secrets of the gods. The making of the divine into the real way in which we conduct our lives right here on earth. And so the divinity isn't just up there with the very sordid world of sin and death down here, but that something miraculous has happened, that the idea has become real. And this is the whole this is the idea of prophetic Judaism. This is what makes him a real prophetic Jew.
I'm starting to believe that Don and I communicate telepathically, because I did want to get back to the Lord's Prayer for just a second here, and Don segued into what I wanted to do almost perfectly without us talking about it, which is really kind of scary. But we mentioned at the beginning, there are two versions of the Lord's Prayer. The one in Luke is shorter.
And omits.
What's interesting is Matthew had a copy of Mark and incorporated almost 80% of Mark. So we know that Matthew had a copy of Mark. We know Luke had a copy of both Mark and Matthew, because Luke incorporated some unique Matthew material almost verbatim. Yet Luke always seems to expand on the other two synoptics. But in the case of the Lord's Prayer, he didn't. He left out things, which is kind of unusual. Why did he leave it out? What he left out were all the references to heaven. Matthew says, Our Father in heaven. Luke just says, Father, hallowed be thy name. Your will be done is left out in Luke. On earth as it is in heaven is left out. And but deliver us from evil is left out of Luke. So I just found it curious why Luke had to intentionally leave them out, because he had a copy of it sitting in front of him. I'm just curious as to why he would...
No, you're right, that's one theory. There's an alternative theory, which is that Matthew is an elaboration of Luke. And in fact, I think it was in some of that literature that you sent us about the reconstruction of the Q document underlies, one theory is that it's actually Luke who is the more literal presenter of what's in the Q document, and that Matthew takes the liberty, and I think we have a lot to thank him for when it comes to this. I'm not saying he makes things up, but I think they believe, the scholars tell us, that Luke may be the more accurate original, a little too simple for Matthew, who wanted to take that and to bring out its meaning. So this, I don't know, that your first theory could be just as good as, it is just as good as mine. What I'm trying to say is we don't know.
Yeah, supposedly.
Matthew and Luke are about
the same time.
About the same time, around 80 to 85 AD, whereas Mark is back at 70 AD and is one of our sources. And that Q document that is also, we can see, pulled into both Luke and Matthew, though in different ways. Matthew gives us the Sermon on the Mount. He puts them all together in that wonderful thing, 3 chapters of Matthew, 5 through 7, whereas Luke takes them and spreads them out in his gospel. He keeps the sayings. He doesn't always treat them exactly the same way. The verbiage differs slightly. You can see it's from the same source. So you don't know whether Matthew's an elaboration or whether Luke is a simplification. Yes, both of those are possible.
Yeah, unfortunately, biblical scholars are a lot like scientists. They tend to state things as if they're an absolute fact, when actually it's like nobody really knows the exact dates that these were written. It's kind of a lot of speculation and everything, but it is interesting that there are 2 different versions of this. It would, from this content point of view, it would make sense that Matthew has elaborated on what's in Luke.
It might. But it seems to me that regardless of all of that, we have, in any case, a putting of words into Jesus' mouth. Let's remind ourselves, Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, is 40 years or so after the crucifixion. A lot has gone on. Paul has done all of his work and has written all of his letters already before the first gospel is actually, at least the one as it comes down to us, is actually written. Only about 70 AD do we get the beginnings of the gospel tradition. And in any event, it was kept alive to a certain extent by an oral tradition, then written down. Oral traditions continued. They coexisted at the same time as they had written documents. Yes, there were a lot of stories circulating. One had heard. That's where I think where Luke gets some of his special material, for example. He has heard what he has heard, and he puts it into the story. Luke says at the very beginning that he wants to be very scrupulous about the way he does this, and very systematic, and he tends to include everything he knows. So each has its own particular flavor, but each one of them comes long after the event, and it's an attempt to reconstruct. They are already trying to figure out what it was that happened 40 years ago. And I think you can even see, part of my thesis, by the way, is that Mark doesn't quite get everything. By the time we get to Mark, he doesn't quite see that Jesus was a real social revolutionary. Changes have already occurred in the theology, the expectations, the possibility of actually transforming society through political action. Jesus was into that. I mean, my thesis is that he was a nonviolent revolutionary and a genius in that respect. It was a breakthrough in history to understand that you could overthrow the current order of things by organized nonviolence. It's where we get a whole strand, by the way, of contemporary thinking through Martin Luther King and Gandhi, as we've discussed. It's a whole approach and an understanding of what some Christians say, what the heart and soul of Christianity is really all about. It's changing the world in this particular way through means of peace, but forcefully. And this is, I think, the way you put it all together. But I don't think that Mark quite even understands all of what he himself is writing about. Can you see how
he doesn't get the gravity.
I don't see how you see how wonderful an idea it is that the writer of a story doesn't quite get what he himself is giving us. We owe it to him that we have this stuff at all. But he himself is grappling with problems that he doesn't quite understand. And I don't think he gets all of what the Jesus movement was all about.
Or is it possible he just couldn't get it out? Because it's my understanding, I don't know the Greek, but the Greek is very poor in Mark. And if you just even read Mark in translation, the story's very choppy. It goes from here to here. It's like an outline. He put a few more adjectives in, and it's like, okay, this is it. Where Luke is extremely literary. Luke's an outstanding writer.
Mark was the secretary of the historian. You said, take the meeting of the minutes, Mark. And Mark was like, okay, I just got to get this done. You know, I don't really care what I have.
And then he tossed a couple of adjectives in and articles, and it's like, okay, it's done.
A word or two.
His heart wasn't in it completely.
A word or two of defense of dear Mark. Mark was the first gospel I got to know well. Yes, the Greek can be called crude, but it can also be called vigorous. And he is a vigorous, down-to-earth writer who gives us a vigorous, down-to-earth Jesus. And that's a very, very important part of what he contributes. So I'll always love Mark, but when, for example, Matthew takes Mark as a source, combines it with another source of sayings that we know must have existed, we can see the evidence for that, and now, perhaps 15 years later, around 85 AD, and Mark was 70, with these materials now sitting at his desk, he can have the greater leisure to craft something literary on a slightly different level, writing for his own specific audience. And Luke, he had his specific audience, Gentiles. Luke is the gospel that we can quite clearly identify as a gospel written by a Jewish writer who nonetheless wanted to report these events to the Gentile world. There has therefore been speculation that Luke may have been a Gentile himself. That has appeared as a speculation. But most of the scholars say, no, he probably was a Jew writing for Gentiles. Anyway, it's most complex then to get back to this, to reconstruct what actually may have happened. We have grown up, for example, with an idea of the crucifixion, the trial and the crucifixion, that fundamentally Jesus went to his death on trumped-up charges, that all he was really guilty of was blasphemy or saying something that these Pharisees or scribes didn't like, but he didn't really do anything. He didn't really break fundamental laws of the state. I'm trying to suggest that this is a misunderstanding. I don't think he wanted to get arrested, and I think he tried to avoid arrest. But when he was brought before the Sanhedrin and then in front of Pilate, I think it's quite clear that they had evidence that he was involved in an attempt to overthrow the existing social order. That he had engaged, and this is where Jeff, thank you, Jeff. During the last week, Jeff has done some bibliographical work, because part of the thesis that has emerged, as you'll recall, we've discussed this a little bit, is the idea that one major thing that this subversive, remember, committed to nonviolent means. Now you got to think, if you're a nonviolent revolutionary, what can you do to try to overthrow a government? And one answer appears to be right there in Luke. I don't know why history has missed this, because Luke virtually tells us that the only charge that was actually brought to Pilate himself to justify the crucifixion was that he opposed Roman taxation. Not only opposed Roman taxation, but in a way that deserves death. We're also told in Luke that spies were sent to Jesus to try to trap him, the word is used, trap him, by asking him the question, what about paying taxes to Caesar, Jesus? That's the famous scene. And Jesus brilliantly answers with a non-answer. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. What does that mean? Sure, give to God what properly belongs to God and gives to Caesar. Is that an answer to the question of what's your position on Roman taxation? He doesn't answer that question. And it's at a party, by the way. The story is very interestingly told. This is not an inquest. This is these are spies who are sent to a local get-together, and they try to trap Jesus in casual conversation into admitting that he's involved in a tax rebellion. I can't call it anything else. There must have been. It's a hypothesis. Now I present it simply as a hypothesis. One of the main tactics used by the Jesus movement was tax rebellion. It could have involved various aspects. We know that tax collectors, this is what I have to thank Jeff for. Jeff was inspired enough to go and find all the passages in which tax collectors, of all the professions, there were lots of things that people did back in those days, metal workers and whatnot. But the one profession which keeps getting mentioned, the kind of people that Jesus, he was hanging out with tax collectors.
A little bit of history here.
Yeah.
Don and I were having a conversation on Tuesday of last week. And in listening to it again, it's like we used a lot of the statements that tax collectors are all over the New Testament. And I went like, well, how many times does it really occur? Is this like we just think it occurred a lot? So I went back and took my Logos software and searched tax and tax collectors. And it turns out there are quite a few, and some of them are rather interesting. Jesus baptized. He had tax collectors baptized. And in one, all three synoptics have Matthew or Levi being a tax collector. When Levi is called, in one, he's in his tax booth, and Jesus says, come and follow me, and he leaves. And then right after that, Levi or Matthew throws a party for Jesus with his other tax collector friends. And the passage specifically says they were reclining and eating. Now, that seems to connotate there was something more than food here. Were they talking business? And it's a very unusual passage that goes to the length of saying he threw a banquet for him, and they were all reclining and eating. It doesn't say, well, were they talking business?
Well, I told you, Jeff, though, that as a Jew, let me say, that a vivid moment during the Passover Seder every year is when the child asks the 4 questions. He asked, one of those 4 critical questions asked that night is, why do we recline tonight rather than sitting up at the table? We recline. And the answer has to do with we take it easy. We were once slaves. Now, in other words, that Jesus was reclining with tax collectors, to me, with that coloration, would mean something like they were just hanging.
Comfort level.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, there's an awful lot, probably around 20 individual references where it specifically mentions tax collectors. But then if you search taxes, you get the story of the temple tax and the drachma, or the money in the fish's mouth, and you get the story of rendering to Caesar. So there's more than just a casual circumstance here, that when you add that on top of, the Romans did not crucify anybody except for sedition. The Romans, it's a misconception that the two people that were crucified with Jesus were bandits.
But to have sedition against Rome, you have to have the breaking of Roman law. Not just law, but Roman law. Judean law would not be enough to justify crucifixion by Roman law. You would have to prove to Pontius Pilate that what this fellow was doing was criminal behavior aimed at undermining the Roman state. And this is what they would have to prove in any fair trial. And I propose to you that's what they were able to prove at trial, because in fact Jesus and his group had been doing this. We have plenty of evidence. It's the only thing that Luke says specifically was brought to Pilate as a criminal charge. The only specific criminal charge that is mentioned is opposition to Roman taxation. One thing.
And the other thing that's significant is the great reluctance of Pilate to actually crucify him is all through the trial. And if you look carefully at this and study the history, Pilate's sitting on top of a powder keg that's already erupted numerous times. He's very much aware if he does the wrong thing, he could have a riot on his hands. So he's not really willing to crucify someone on someone else's account. He wants to know exactly what is it that he's done, and did he deserve crucifixion? And gosh, before he got to that point, he said, well, look, I'll go ahead and scourge him. You know, we'll beat him, and will that satisfy you? And it didn't. And that's highly unusual. The Romans did not torture somebody before they crucified them, for the simple reason that they died too quickly, which is what Jesus did. Jesus was a very atypical crucifixion because most people lingered on the cross intentionally for days. So there's a whole lot of nuances in this story that all point to the fact that Jesus must have been doing something that irritated them to the point that they were willing to crucify him in light of what the political ramifications of that could be afterwards.
But last week, didn't we say that, didn't Don say that, both of you said, that when it was something that Jesus said where he he used I can't say it as well as you did, Don, where Jesus said to him, when Pilate asked him what he did, he answered him in a way that, knowing Jewish law, knowing the Bible, he told him what he was doing. He told him what he was doing. He told him he was in for this insurrection. He told him that he was up to an insurrection, and that in his words, and if you didn't understand the behind story, the back story,
That's right.
you wouldn't get it.
And that's why Mark is very important here, because Mark makes this crystal clear. The quotation that Jesus makes of the book of Daniel, when the high priest asks him, this is a critical moment. In fact, when we assemble our evidence and try to figure out what justifies our taking a certain kind of position, if you ask what justifies the specific idea that Jesus was in favor of an actual social revolution here on earth, it's that at the critical moment of when he's asked by the high priest to identify who he is and what he's doing, he answers by making an unmistakable quotation from the Hebrew Bible, the book of Daniel, where Daniel talks about, chapter 7 is about how the saints of the Most High, the saints of God, the holy people of God, are going to actually defeat the governments of the world. And it's a clear self-identification as a social revolutionary. He does. That's the critical.
Not everyone got
Yes.
that. Not everyone got that. Only the most learned, including Herod, got that.
I don't even know whether Mark, again,
Right.
fully gets it.
Well,
He
I never.
reported-
Well, the other thing that's important here is that if Jesus would have just been a blasphemer, which is what the high priest accused him of, the Romans would have cared less. The Romans did not persecute other religions. They were rather tolerant, unless that religion interfered with government business. So the fact that he was brought there supposedly as a spiritual blasphemer would not have impressed Pilate in the least. He could have cared less.
And yet, it's how we prefer to remember Jesus. Jesus wasn't a bad boy. He didn't deserve to die. Well, wrong. He was a bad boy. And he did deserve to die according to Roman law. So the idea that it was all trumped up and he did not deserve this execution is a wrong conception. It therefore mistakes what he was up to. It forgets that it was a social revolution that was involved in his thinking.
Well, and that's what's wrong. I mean, that's where I think in my mind the wrong comes in is the fact that the social revolution was considered so egregious. You know, the fact that their social order was being threatened, and that was what their laws were meant to protect.
Yeah, but
For good or for bad.
it's the same regime that's still in place now. It's an authoritative regime.
Right. Sure.
The revolution, let's face it, has not yet occurred. The revolution that later on in history, we get it over and over and over again. The idea of it repeats over. Karl Marx is only one of the last versions of it.
Well, the other thing, the great comment that you hear today all the time is, follow the money. With Rome, it was all about the money. You could be a little bit of a seditionist. You could be a Sicarii running around with a curved knife and be a bit of an assassin and everything, as long as it didn't grow too big and really affect how things ran. But if you interfered with Rome's money and taxes, that was pretty much the trigger point.
Right. So this pious memory of the gentle Jesus that we have, he was, you see, here's where we failed to hold two things in our hands at the same time. The idea that he really subscribed to nonviolence. The fact that he's really subscribed to nonviolence leads us to believe that he was not involved in a war against the state. Wrong. He was totally committed to nonviolence and committed to a war against the state. A nonviolent war. I want to stress this point. It is this strand of Christian thinking.
Well, the other thing that I've now been able to piece together is people are always kind of, well, Jesus at the trial was kind of me. He never ever answered a question. He was evasive. Pilate didn't understand. Jesus was like that whenever anybody questioned. Between the fish story and Render Under Caesar.
Oh, and what you Christians have done, you don't even get how funny he can be. That story of the fish.
Yeah.
Gets reported by Christians. You Christians have actually believed that the fish was caught by Peter, that he did find a coin, 4 drachmas, was it?
It was a two.
2 times 2.
It was 2 times 2 because it was hit for him and
Probably
someone
like a
else.
$4 bill that didn't exist, you know.
But the simple Jesus is like the DS in the Methodist Church. You ask him a yes or no question, and you get talk, but he never answers the question. Jesus never answers a yes or no question, yes or no.
And here's where you have to understand another thing about how good a Jew he really was. He was a dialectician. He was an expert at argumentation. He defeated everybody. There have been very, very few. Socrates, of course, comes to mind.
Got him killed too.
That's got him killed too. One can in fact name some great practicers of this art of language and of argumentation, winning debates, and when you're cornered, even evading questions. Sometimes you reply to the topic. Sometimes you know how to change the topic and get out of a difficulty. Jesus was brilliant.
Nothing frustrates someone who's trying to make their point than arguing with someone that they can't wrap their hands around and get back at them. Everything they say is like they said something, but they never answered the question.
It ends with Constitution Avenue being shut down with them standing in front of there with a Bible upside down.
And remember what he says when he sends out the 12 apostles in Mark. The wonderful saying, obviously early, I want to say obviously something he really said. Be as cunning as snakes and gentle as doves.
Yeah.
Cunning as a snake is what he was. Gentle as a dove is what he was, is the idea here. This, in a certain sense, is a high point in Jewish being, is what this man actually embodied. I keep wanting to repeat that my quest here as a Jew is to rescue Jesus from you Christians, you know, who have held him hostage all these years. Yes.
Well, since we're coming up on Ash Wednesday and starting Lent, the one thing that in a way bothers me is we seem, I won't overgeneralize to all Christians, but we seem to be obsessed with his physical death to an unhealthy point. We have Stations of the Cross. We track the whole gruesome thing. To be crucified was a horrible way to die. It was one of the most feared ways of dying. Yet we become obsessed with it to the point where it's almost unhealthy. That's why Good Friday services and Ash Wednesday services make me very uncomfortable to the point I don't want to go. Because we're fixated on the wrong thing.
Well, fixated to the point where you don't try to get a deeper understanding of the nuances of it. I think I see what you're saying. You get so wrapped up in the external that you can't really get like all this. You know, you really can't get the deeper meaning of it all. I also find it very interesting. I just find it very interesting that in our lifetime, two people that came off like that. There are others, but who were really prominent in our lifetimes are Martin Luther King and John Lewis and those types. It really did that kind of thing. They were social revolutionaries in a relatively peaceful way that didn't turn out that way. But he proposed that too, didn't he?
Yeah.
John, I mean, I don't know that well, but
I propose to you, if we were to purport to be followers of Jesus, you would be involved in a movement. It's a movement. It's not a coming to church on Sunday and having, yes, it's nice to have such moments of reflection and meditation, prayer in one's life, but that's incomplete. It's not wrong, it's incomplete. What Jesus was into was putting this into actual practice. We've got to be involved in changing the world. We've got to have an organized movement. We've got to be doing things to bring it about.
One of the reasons why they think the early Christian church grew so rapidly was if you look at the fact that you're living in a world where 99% of the people are living in abject poverty. Back then, it was truly the 1% that were rich, and the others were absolute. There was no middle class. You were either rich or you were absolutely destitute. And the one thing that the Christians did in following Jesus's instructions was to take care of each other. And that was really important because they were one of the few groups of people that were doing it.
Right, and this is why taking care of each other is an important segue. You have to understand that the way he conceived this, it's obvious, it's very, very clear that there were various aspects to the whole project that the group was involved in. Yes, there were these provocative practices like whatever was going on with the taxes and demonstrations like the money changers in the temple, almost a violent action, a demonstration of a certain kind. But let's not forget that a large part of what they were doing was actually society building, trying to win people over and to learn a new way of life amongst themselves. He actually had the conviction. This is the whole seed metaphor, the mustard seed metaphor. A tiny little seed becomes a great big bush. How does this happen? It goes viral. Now here's another aspect of Jesus' genius. Going viral is the very idea of his chief parables, of the seed that miraculously grows into something where, wow, out of nowhere comes this. Well, that's one interpretation of that.
Well,
taking it to the world, that the idea, yes, is that this is something that can't avoid spreading like wildfire. The idea of spreading like wildfire, takeoff velocity, critical mass, going viral.
To put that in perspective, most people don't understand. Going viral to most people just says it exploded really fast.
It means exponential growth.
Yeah. What it means is two people told another, then you had 4 people, then you have 8 people, then you have 16 people. Facebook is an excellent example of why it's so popular. You put a post on that people really like, they send it to they share it with all their friends. Those friends share it with all their friends. And within hours, you can go from 120 people up to almost 500,000 or 1 million people.
YouTube is actual. The actual ability to go viral. Yes, it would seem to me that if Jesus was sitting in this room right now, he'd say, "You idiots, don't you see what you have?" As when it comes to the possibility of virality, do you see what you have in terms of spreading the word all over the world? It's wonderful about the internet, by the way. It gets through to everywhere.
Which is one of the things that we tend to miss if you've ever been to a Methodist missionary course on what you do as a missionary. It's not about going and talking to 100 people. It's about going and talking to 2 or 3 or 4 people. And then you've got to be willing to walk away and let it take its course. And there are an awful lot of people that feel they have to accomplish it while they're there. And that's not really the point of missionary work. All you need to do is impact the few people that you're around and let nature take its course.
I wanted to stress also that the healings.
10 minutes. Yeah.
That the healings thing, talk about constructive work, society building, learning, viral growth of the society itself, but also notice the stress on healings all the time. Clearly, a big part of the project had to do with that also. A lot of damaged people in the world. Now, when I see those passages about the demoniacs that he had to deal with, the one that I recall especially is the guy who lived in the tombs, who ran around naked and lived in the area of the tombs. Wasn't he the one who, he was Legion. He was the one who
went into the pigs over the cliff?
Yes, that's the Legion story. In our terms, there are a lot of people afflicted with demons. Or even simpler terms, the way we might put it, there are a lot of damaged people in the world. And a lot of the ugliness of the world is because we're damaged ourselves. And that a big part of changing the world has got to be to try to undo the damage. How? Clearly, Jesus believed that a certain kind of interaction with people based upon empathy, real dialogue with the other, was of immense curative power. It was a healing kind of thing. We know the kind of thing he practiced. We can tell from the Sermon on the Mount the kinds of ways that he was trying to get through to people about not living inside their own egoistic world, but get out of yourself. Get into what it means to care about others. Scrooge's great conversion moment, when he realized that the miser is miserable, that you're miserable because of your egoism. And that true joy is to be found in going out of it and finding love with other people. There's no reason why this shouldn't be. And if it were to be the case, we wouldn't have the violence that we have in the world that actually exists.
And this is very difficult for Christians today to understand because we all have a scientific worldview. We've got a total disconnect to the worldview that Jesus had and the people back then. They believed that demons were real. I've been reading a lot of Carl Gustav Jung, who was a psychologist that hung out with Freud. And he proposed that demons are real, but they're all up here. And they're real. And you've got to deal with them. And that's why he kind of fell into disfavor, because he was scientific, but he was dealing with the mind, not with the physical world. His writing is incredible in terms of he went into all the imagery that we use that's associated with demons, alchemy, and he almost sounds like a New Ager, but it's all rooted in this is all in people's minds, and if people think it's real, it's real.
And we think crudely about what a demon is. We think about the movie The Exorcist, for example. We think it has to be like that. We forget that a demon is a bad spirit. and when you put it in those terms, that a specific kind of bad spirit occupies your mind, makes you behave in certain kinds of ways, and so on, and makes you very unhappy, makes you very, very unhappy.
Doing righteous things is a healthy mind, a sign of a healthy mind. Doing things for others is a sign of a healthy mind. When you start jumping into what we know is wrong, taking advantage of other people, killing, and those types of things it's a sickness. We talked about that last week. It's a sickness to people. And the more and more they do it, that sickness takes hold, their thoughts. And that's where I think they came up with the term demons, that they constantly can't get away from doing bad things. I'm not sure if there's ever their physical demon. I've never seen a physical demon myself, so it's hard for me to say.
The demon becomes physical when you do something because of what's in your head that's not right. Then it becomes physical. It goes from the mind into the physical world.
And I just think that if the evangelical side puts too much on the exorcist, actually there being a physical form that goes inside of somebody, that's the sickness. That's not really a physical thing. That's the sickness.
Even if we just followed Wesley's one statement, who said, even if you can't do anything positive, at a bare minimum, do no harm.
You can't argue with that.
You can, because half the Methodist Church is arguing with it. Another topic we don't want to get into.
Well, we got into Thy Will Be Done, which jumped into Daniel. You sent information, I think, this week about looking at Daniel. It's showing the sovereignty of God. Maybe Luke decided that, hey, it's obvious, sovereignty of God, I will include that, where Matthew included the Thy Will Be Done. I think back then it may have been it's obvious to people. You don't have to put it in there. But Matthew's like, no. The way this world is so screwed up, I'm going to have to put that in there so people realize.
Look, each of these guys was a writer.
Yeah.
They were doing their best as writers. You have material in front of you, but your job is to construct the most coherent story that you can construct as a writer. You're sitting at a certain time and place, and you have a certain audience in mind that you want to communicate to. You have your materials, and you want to do your materials justice. Now, Matthew is a certain person who, to do his materials justice and to construct what he saw was a coherent story, he did it his way. Luke was a different guy. I want to say thank goodness we have different guys involved here, each writing a different version of the story, so we can triangulate. So we can say this guy's this, and this. Yes, of course, there are contradictions. Those aren't even interesting so much as...
Well, if you ask the four of us to write down the most important things that we just discussed about here this morning, you
we're all
get
gonna
four
get
different views
views,
of what we
different
thought.
perspectives.
Yeah.
And
That's
it
right.
depends, like we talked earlier, your background and things you've read or been taught by others.
Depending on where society is in the evolutionary level,
Yeah.
you de-evolutionize it and say, mine would be the most important because I was the man, But now that society has gone beyond that, they take into account, hey, my
So did what we discuss here about, for no better, the politics of Jesus, just to kind of put a moniker on it, does that make Jesus a more spiritual person to you or less? Can you identify him with him more?
I think it made him more human.
Yeah.
And he really is a religious soul, let us not forget. There's a whole dimension that we do have to bring back. He wasn't just a social revolutionary. He was a social revolutionary because he thought that was what was necessary. But this transformed world would be a truly transformed world. How transformed? So transformed that it would involve the resurrection of the dead. He believed in that. We might think we're domesticating Jesus by making him into just a social revolutionary. No, this is a man who also believed that one of the accomplishments of this was the overcoming of the world of sin and death and the institution of something that we call eternal life.
Well, let me put a counterpoint onto that to kind of bring it home. You've made the statement that in John, Jesus' feet barely touched the ground.
Ethereal, almost, he's not human.
Yet In John, Jesus stands in a room. Imagine Jesus being in this room and him saying, there are theirs among you here that are more righteous than I am, which he does say in John. The whole idea of John is that what Jesus is at his best, you can be too. And as Christians, we don't wrap our minds around that because we think of Jesus being God and gosh, how can we be God? But he actually, the whole process of being born again is turning into that person that is just as righteous as Jesus was.
And yet, we can be like him, and yet one of the great chief tragedies of the crucifixion was the fact that I don't think he died willingly, although he had to admit what he was. The greatest tragedy of that is that he didn't live to continue to lead this movement. He was taken from them. It's one of the greatest tragedies that you Christians also miss, because you have such a happy ending. He rose and he's in heaven and everything, and it all has a happy ending.
But how much more could we have gained if he lived?
That we'll never know. But I suspect that this genius, who was lost in his prime, clearly in his 30s, who was the leader of a great movement already. Now, I don't see this as a desiring to go to his death. A lot of Christian writers actually tell the story that way.